chairs ministry. What I mean by that is if you're sitting in the chair, you're part of my ministry. And then I branched out to Chairs for Cambodia. So some of you know that I've been there, and they brought me all the way there to set up chairs. And so they decided to let me branch out a little bit. And so I was like, oh, this is cool, I'll come up here. And our first sermon prep meeting, Pastor Josh was very clear to look at me when I brought this up, and he says, you know you're still doing the chairs. So lo and behold, I set up the chairs today. And so I'm very, very excited to bring this passage to you today from John chapter 6, which I realize we haven't read yet. So let's, can we get that up on the screen? So we're actually going to go back to, this would be 2 weeks ago, finishing the end of the previous story. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So I titled this message An Old Sea Tale, not only because it involves people being on water, but because it has this element to it that reminds me of a sea tale. So if you think of a sea tale, you have different people telling one story, and you always get a couple people that are probably exaggerating, and you get a couple people that are thrown in these details where you're like, that's really cool, but this guy may be nuts, I'm not sure. You have different elements of pieces coming together, and you have to discern for yourself what in the world is going on. And so what I want you to do is look back at this bizarre way that John actually tells us this story, and I want you to imagine that you're sitting in some kind of a sea tavern right now. So, you know, maybe some oil candle lamps, some oars on the wall, you're eating fish, it's dimly lit, probably smells like mustiness. So you're sitting at this table and the disciples are there and they're telling you this story. And you're there and there's some other, like some Jews are there that are hearing this for the first time, and the disciples have to somehow communicate this story of Jesus walking on water. And so I imagine Peter with this like raspy sailor, philosopher, crotchety something old guy, who sometimes comes out Irish when I'm describing him. And he's kind of like, and there I was. I have a story to tell you about this. A storm came a-brewing. And it came rolling down the mountain, over the ocean, or over the sea. And the boat was rocking. So I kept rowing, and rowing, and rowing. But I was going nowhere. And there he was, like a ghost, walking over the water. And then I too stepped out of the boat, and I walked on the water. And then Matthew has some sarcastic, like, puts his fish down, elbows him, and he's like, dude, you fell in. Humbles him a little bit there. But then we see John. And John's sitting kind of the same circle, but he's sitting, and he's different. And he's pensive, and he's looking like he's traumatized, but he's got a smile on his face. Something really strange just happened. And you can hear him kind of muddle. You think a storm is terrifying, but you don't know terror until you've seen a friend walk across the water. What power is that? And you're sitting there, and you have to ask yourself this question as you hear this sea tale. What do we do with this? How do we make sense of this? So all of that goofiness of a story aside, when I read this text in John, it feels this way. You may have heard, or at least heard of, the story of Jesus walking on water. And we get these different versions where Matthew tells us a lot about Peter walking out on the water. If you notice when we read this, there's no discussion of that. Mark talks about this and tells a little bit of a different story. John doesn't seem to be wanting to tell us anything. Have you ever been part of an inside joke? Except you're not on the inside, you're on the outside of the inside joke. And you know something is being said, and you're like, what in the world is being said? And it starts to get kind of frustrating. That's how I felt when I started reading John. And to link back to Cambodia, I actually experienced this not too long ago. I found myself like once a night in a room with like a family of people that did not speak English, and they would just start cracking up. Like it was the funniest thing they ever heard. They'd just laugh and laugh and laugh, and I kept asking them, what is funny? What is funny? And they wouldn't say anything. And then they'd all stop laughing, and they'd pause, and they'd turn and look to me, and then they're crying. Then they're just laughing harder. So, okay, great, it's about me. So then finally, I look over, if there's someone there that speaks English, I look over and you gotta like grab on, like, what is funny? And then finally I get this like 16-year-old girl to go, oh, it's a joke. I know it's a joke, thanks. Thank you. That's all I got. But see, John, the one whose gospel is like 80 or 90 or something percent unique from the other gospels, John normally clarifies to me what the other gospel writers are saying. In this case, it feels like he's not telling me anything. At first glance, it feels like we just skip over this passage. But you see, if we're going to believe that this is the Word of God, that it is living and speaking to us, that it's not in there by mistake. John must be saying something. So Lord willing, we're going to try to discern that. Now, for those of you who are not regularly here, you're seeing these slides that say Bizarro. So this is a theme that we've been going through, which highlights this idea of backwards but true. And so I see three levels of this Bizarro happening right now. The first one being John, the guy who normally says things backwards from everybody else, is saying things backwards from himself. So it's backwards, but somehow not forwards. It's still not clear. Level 2, Jesus is walking on water. If I have to explain that point is lost. Level 3 then is we think of this text as something about water. There's something with water going on. But I would argue that it's actually a very ordinary-ish interaction that's happening between Jesus and these disciples that's teaching us something really interesting. So with that, I want to turn back to the text. Like I said, we have to hook back to the previous story to really start to make sense of this. So we had talked about the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, and so I'm just going to read those passages one more time. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So what's happening here is there's a climax of this other story where Jesus does a miracle. He multiplies the bread and feeds the 5,000. And the climax of what people should be learning here is that this is not just some new guy. This is actually the same God that we've had eternally, that we've seen before. And they're starting to draw these parallels with Moses, which we see in the text. So I'm going to break that down just a little bit in case you haven't read anything from Moses lately. Moses was a leader who led the Israelites out of Egypt, and he was known for parting the Red Sea. Maybe you've seen that. And he was known for, when they were in the wilderness, God used him to bring bread or manna from heaven, which fed people who would otherwise have died in the wilderness. So now they're seeing, oh, Jesus made bread. Maybe this is the guy Moses told us was coming. And actually, Moses had said in Scripture that he was coming. So if we look at Deuteronomy 18:15, it says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me being Moses, from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." So people, this is starting to resonate. People are seeing Jesus in this story, and they're like, maybe you're that guy. Are you that guy? He's like Moses. And so one guy, a rabbi, draws a connection, and he says this really well. And I'm paraphrasing this. A 3rd century rabbi named Isaac says, "As the former Redeemer caused manna to rain from heaven, so the latter Redeemer will cause manna to descend from heaven." So they're making this connection, and they're not quite sure what to do with this yet. But Jesus is showing them that he is not only God now, he is the same God that did this through Moses before. So they get this sign, and then something really weird happens. Verse 15 happens, and it's the one where they have completely the wrong reaction. So they see Jesus, and they're like, a lot of them think, this is the perfect leader. This is the one, this is the guy. He's the one that will overthrow Rome, which was a big thing for them at that time. They felt very oppressed. A lot of them wanted a military leader. He will overthrow Rome, just immediately jump to this, like, Jesus for president right now. Like, just follow this guy, just do it. And they go and they're like, okay, Jesus, this is what you gotta do. You're gonna be king. It says they've tried to force him. Like, Jesus, we know what you need to do. And then you get probably a second group of people that the text doesn't talk about as much, but they're basically like, oh, sweet, free food. So he becomes something of either a warlord or a divine grocery store. Take your pick. And he's not really liking this. And honestly, when I was writing this, I'm trying to process, like, which group would I be in and what would this feel like? And no joke, I'm walking out the door and my phone like beeps and it's Chick-fil-A. And it does this thing once in a while where it's like, if you're a Denver resident, swing by for free breakfast. Oh, so this is what manna from heaven looks like. Of course it's Chick-fil-A. Of course. But then I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, the people here are the exact same people that if they existed today, they'd be like, we need to make an app. We're gonna make a Jesus app, we're gonna put in our order, we're gonna click a button, and Jesus will know exactly what we want, and it's gonna be super fast, super awesome. Let's make a Jesus app. And so Jesus actually recognizes this corruption. Like me in that Cambodia story, they're hearing things, they're not getting it. They're seeing things and they're not getting it. And so Jesus does something very wise. He retreats to pray to the Father. Now we don't know what he said, but I imagine it's something like this. God, I did exactly what you asked. I showed them who I am. I told them who I am. They still don't get it. What do I do? And I like to think that God's response to this prayer was something like, let's amp this up a little bit. So Jesus does something, and we learn from other accounts that he actually sends the disciples away. He sends them off, and then he kind of dismisses the crowd before he does this prayer. Now, he does this, I think, because he doesn't want to get this wrong. He's not willing to let their minds be corrupted by this kind of thinking. Get them out of there. Let's try this again. Let's get this right. And so, where he's not willing to fail, he, again, goes and prays, sends them off, and they're rowing, as in this story, and a storm comes. So now the disciples find themselves on what was probably a tiny little fishing boat, crossing the Sea of Galilee, at probably night, it was dark, and a storm comes, without their light, their guide, their friend Jesus. So the text says in verse 16, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So I want you to just put yourself in this scenario. You're probably in a tiny rowboat that's barely wider than you. You're probably crouched down as far as you can get just to keep your gravity down. You got who knows how many other guys sitting around you trying to fit in this boat. And you're just rowing, and we actually know that they were probably almost there. They've been rowing a while. They're probably tired. And all of a sudden, you feel this wind move in. Not unlike what I think we would feel here when we feel that cold wind blow down the mountains, and you can kind of just feel that snowy wind roll in. It's that wind that like hits you in the back of the neck and your spine gets hard as a rock, and it just feels absolutely terrible. I imagine that wind rolling in and hitting them, and then they're crouched down trying to row, water splashing them in the face. You know, their eyes are stinging. They're still just pushing and tired and pushing. And then it's dark. So you think you're almost there, but you're looking ahead and you just see dark. You don't know. How horrible would that be? How terrifying would that be? And Noah too, at this time, being in Colorado, we like to consider ourselves an ocean people. But if you were to ask an ocean people to talk about the ocean, it's terrifying. It's absolutely a terrifying thing. It's something that, it's beautiful, but it's chaotic. And if something goes wrong, the ocean is death. And they're experiencing this right now. If this boat tips over, they have a big problem. And so what do? You think that this panic is setting in, but then John gives us another really interesting detail. Let's look at the text again at verse 19. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Now, to be honest, I was frightened when I said they rowed for 3 or 4 miles, but they kept going. And so, the interesting detail that John gives us is that through all of this, the terror does not come from the storm. Did you catch that? The terror came from when they saw their friend, Jesus, the one who they had decided already to lay down their lives and follow. Seeing him approach them was what caused the terror. How does that happen? How do you see your friend, your dear friend that you've given your life for, and will continue to give your life for? How does that become the thing that's more terrifying than this storm? Well, you see, it was through this awesome display of the power of God that these people were shook. Mark retells the story saying Jesus appeared like a ghost over the water. And I kind of like in my own head hear like the Transformers music where it's like dun dun dun. And he's just like walking and like no waves are doing anything. The wind's doing nothing. He's just like superpowered going through it. But he appears like a ghost, and this is terrifying. So the problem here then was not being caught in a storm. The problem was that the disciples had such a limited understanding of what God would actually be able to do. Or another way of saying this, they lacked a healthy fear of the Lord. Now when I say fear, I do mean the word like fear, like afraid. That's one use that the Bible has for the word fear. But a better way to think of it, or another way to think of it rather, is kind of like a respect. It's a worship posture of your heart. It's this idea of the Lord's power is so great that the only way I can respond is to actually bow down and worship that power. And that's what I mean by the fear of the Lord here. They weren't ready to believe that this friend, this Jesus, would be the same one that could walk on water. They weren't ready. Their minds couldn't comprehend that. They had a mold that they kind of could fit Jesus into, and this was breaking it. This wasn't working. So I want you to kind of enter this tavern story with me one more time, where you're sitting there and you're eating the fish and you're listening to the story, and they're telling this part, and you're looking around, and all of a sudden it starts to ring a bell. Like you see people are kind of getting something. They're starting to make connections. And with this, I want you to look to Psalm 107, 25 through 30 with me, which I think will be on the screen here in just a second. It says, "For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven." So of course, if you're hearing this story and you are a Jew at that time, you know the Psalms, you pray the Psalms, you can kind of start to predict what's happening. They're like, wait, I think I know how this story ends. Like, is this Jesus going to bring them to safety? No, it can't be that guy. So looking back at John then, at verse 20, "But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going." You see, this is the part out of all of the story where, like I said, Matthew highlights Peter walking on the water. Mark highlights something about the disciples' hearts. John highlights this. He highlights a simple act of taking Jesus into the boat. And when he does that, the storm is alleviated. All these problems are gone. You see, what he does is Jesus reveals himself. That's what changes everything. He references what we call this divine language. It's this I am. So go back to the Moses story. When Moses first meets God in the burning bush, if you've ever heard of that, he starts to talk and he's like, "God, who are you?" And God reveals himself. He says, "I am." He means he's the one that always was, always is, always will be. This is that eternal God that we were talking about a little bit earlier with the previous story. And Jesus says that. We can kind of read this as like, guys, it's me. It's like, it's your buddy Jesus. But he's actually using the same language to say once again, guys, you're not going to miss this point. Well, God used Moses. Jesus is not being just used by God. He is God. He is greater than Moses. He's not letting them miss this awesome power that he has because he is God. And so all of a sudden they can start to understand, and also we understand as readers, that God starts to work in these ways that are completely limitless and completely beyond what we're ready to understand, even to dream up. John puts an emphasis on this idea of Jesus reaching out his hand, extending an invitation. And I think this is really important when they say the disciples took him into the boat. Because I like to picture Jesus just jumping into the boat and elbowing Peter and Matthew and saying, guys, move over. But he doesn't do that. He stands outside the boat and he just says, guys, it's me. It's me. And he allows them that opportunity to recognize that, to process that. And rather than to try to say, Jesus, here's how you get in the boat, like put this foot in and get it on this side so the weight's not messed up. And also, why are you walking on water? They just leave all that. That would be probably my first question. How are you doing that? But they just leave that. They just take him into the boat. And as soon as they do that, John is clear to tell us that everything is still. You see, this power that Jesus is displaying is terrifying. This is both senses of that word fear. This is the same power that will one day judge the world, but this is also the power that is for us and in us as Christians. This is that same power that we can exercise and practice as his children and feel it as love around us. We can feel it like verse 21 says with that storm subsiding. And while that power is awe-striking and fear-causing and everything else, we don't have to fear it because it's for us. And I think sometimes we can forget that. So maybe sometime in your life, you've likely heard some reference to this story before. It's even some cultural thing. I've seen people wearing like lifeguard t-shirts, and then it says like mine walks on water. That was like super big in the 90s. Like there's some reference to this. You've probably heard something about this story. But I think there's a lot of focus on what does this water mean? What do we do with the water? Well, what about the walking on the water? Well, he's my lifeguard. But you see, this story is actually so much more about water. This story has very little to do with the water. When Jesus fed the 5,000, it was very important that he had to show who he was so that he could be comprehended. And not only that, when he gave them the bread, they came and responded to him this way. They said, Jesus, thank you. Here's your instruction manual now. Follow these instructions. You're going to be our king. This is great. This wasn't about the water. This was about what they would call the Messiah, the one who was coming to them, and he was looking for a response. He was looking for them to just see this greatness and submit, and instead of submitting and saying, we will just follow you, they come with instructions. They give him their own requests. They put their own Chick-fil-A mindset on it. I'm totally not bashing Chick-fil-A, I love Chick-fil-A, but they put their own mindset on what Jesus should be, what he should do. And if I'm going to be honest, I'm guilty of this all the time. We get in this mode where I think we like to try to flatter God, where we will be real quiet for a while, and then something bad happens, and we're like, God, you're so great. You're so powerful. And if you would just heal my friend in this very specific way, oh man, that would help me believe. That would really help. Or sometimes we say, God, I have two choices that I've put before me. I really want to do one of these two things. Would you just divinely flip that quarter for me and tell me? Because you're so great, you know. And we trivialize that. We approach God with instructions all the time. I do it all the time. I think it's just our nature to kind of forget exactly who God is sometimes. I thank God that he reminds us. I want to look back at one of the greatest prayers ever prayed that Jesus demonstrates for us. When he's in the Garden of Gethsemane about to die, knowing he's going to be crucified, knowing it's going to be the worst thing ever, it's interesting to look at how he prays to the Father. He says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. What a prayer. He's going into one of the worst things, and maybe at that time, the worst thing that mankind can come up with. And he still says, Father, here's what I want, but do what you want. You know. So it's back to this story. When the disciples cease to put any kind of expectation on God, when they simply just take that hand, the storm ends and all is still. You see that same Jesus, that same hand that's reaching out, is also reaching out to you. Jesus shows his greatest act of that unexpected power and that love and that incomprehensible kind of scheming that we could never, ever come up with in our own minds. He shows us this on the cross when he dies for the sins of the world. Imagine if mankind even tried to conceive of something like that. This was a plan that we could never come up with, but we can all take part in. To all of us, that hand is outstretched. And so we find ourselves oftentimes in that boat where we're just trying to row and row and row and row, and we're pursuing what we think we need to be pursuing, but we're not submitting. We're not taking that hand, even though it's right there. We're not taking the hand. And so I pray for us that next time that God is coming to step into our boats, that instead of trying to say, Jesus, here's the instructions, here's how you get in, here's how we do the weight distribution, here's how this is all going to go down, I pray that next time we just be still, we take his hand, and we let him lead. Now for some of you, maybe Jesus has been standing outside of your boat for a while now. And especially right now, he's getting cold. But his hand's still outstretched. And I want you to know that. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to look at the cross and to look at this power in that light and to understand that that power is for you. That power that terrified the disciples need not terrify you because it can be for you, and that hand is reaching out to you. I want to leave you with a proverb that I enjoy very much. He says, the author of Proverbs says, "In all ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." I want to tell you, you can believe this. In all ways acknowledge, or one translation says submit. In all ways submit to him, and he will make straight your paths. You can believe this. Let's pray.